So next, dependency is exchange. So for example, so when it comes to controller, okay, so I don't want to use new keyword. So to create object of employee every time. For example, you want to create object of employee service. Should create something like this. Employee service obj is equal to new employee service. If you create object like this, so what happens for each and every user, every time the object will be created. If 100 requests comes to your controller, this will be created 100 different times, right? So that leads to a problem. Having too many objects within memory, so would also kill your memory. Like if your main memory is full, so there will be no enough memory to process your other requests. So it would also decrease performance of your application. Okay, so that's why you have to make use of dependency injection. So what I will do, I will not use new keyword. Rather, I will make use of the employee service interface. So wherever I refer I employee service. So what has to be done? So the object has to be injected directly. And I want to make use of some patterns like design patterns like single call, singleton. If I use singleton design pattern, so what has to be done? Whenever the first request from first user comes to your service, the object of employee has to be created, should be holding somewhere. And wherever I use reference of this employee service, there the object should be injected directly. And object should be created only once, and that should be reused towards different sub requests. Okay. So I don't want to use any new keyword. And wherever I refer the interface of the corresponding service, like what is the interface of employee service? I employee service. So wherever I refer this, the corresponding class object has to be injected. So if you want that injection has to be done automatically, so you have to implement dependency injection concept. In order to implement this, just right click on references, go to NuGet packages, okay, and install unity.vbp container. There are many containers that are being provided, okay. So this is one of the popular one. Click on unit.vbp container and get it installed. So once you install this, you should be able to see this unity.vbp. So once this is added, so what it will do, it will add one more file to your app.start folder that is going to be app.unity.config. Here you have to provide, this will take care of resolving the dependencies. Here you have to register all the types. Like this. Install Unity container. Okay. So go to this, and so yeah, you have to install. So this requires your web API container requires another dependency, that is Unity container. So make sure these two are installed, unity.container and unity.web API. So once these two are installed, so it will add a config file under app.status, that is unity.config. So this is a place where you need to register all dependencies. For example, in our case, I have two services, like, if you go to service here, I can see one service, employee service. Under repository, I have one class, employee repository. Okay, in many places, we are creating instances of employee repository, employee service. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to make use of new keyword to create the instance of this wherever it is required. Rather, I would like to inject something like this. So in the wherever I need to call, so I will do one thing. So I'll go to that class, and there inside the constructor of that class, I do mention the reference of the interface, something like this. For example, if I want to create instance of employee repository, no need to use new keyword. Okay, just specify the reference, something like this. I employee repository. So what dependency injection will do, wherever you refer this, the corresponding class instance has to be injected here. Okay, so I don't want to use new keyword to create instance of employee repository. Rather, inside the constructor, I will just refer the corresponding interface. Okay, so wherever I refer this interface, and the corresponding class instance has to be injected. This will not be done automatically. Here under unity config.cs, you have to mention this. So how do I mention this? Container dot register. You will have too many things. Register type, register single call, register singleton. If the same object has to be used towards different requests, use singleton. What singleton will do, whenever the first request comes, for example, I want to inject employee service. So right, I employee service, just import that corresponding namespace. What has to be injected? Employee service has to be injected. So you need to register it. So what happens? Wherever you refer I employee service, the object of this corresponding class will be injected. Okay, here we are telling the system, hey, wherever I refer this namespace, wherever I refer this particular interface, there this corresponding class object has to be injected. Okay, if you can use either register single instance or singleton. If I use singleton, what happens whenever the first request from first user comes to your server, object of employee service will be created, and it will be holding somewhere, and this same object will be reused towards different sub requests. Okay, and this will take care of resolving the dependencies of employee service. I mean, wherever I refer employee service, there your container will inject this object. For example, if I go to controller, employee controller, now what I will do, inside the employee controller, I will just use employee service. And wherever I use employee service, what happens? So whatever is associated with it. So wherever you use employee service, it will just create instance of this and inject that instance over there. So here, the instance of employee service will be injected, and this instance can be reused towards different sub requests. Okay, in the same way, we have employee repository. So wherever I use employee repository, their employee repository should be injected. So like this, you can register in number of types here. Register singleton. I employee repository, what has to be injected? Employee repository has to be injected. Just get that namespace imported here. So wherever I refer employee repository, their instance of employee repository will be injected. Okay, run your application. So now this method has to be called from your application file, because whenever my application gets started, right, all the containers should be registered. So what is that? Unity config dot register components. This method has to be called. So what it will do? So it will call this class, and whatever is there under register component, all these services will be registered. So it will register the singleton pattern of IEmplay service and IEmplay repository service. Okay, so whenever my application is started, this start method will be invoked. So if you want to register something at global level, like whenever my application is started, if something has to be configured, so that should be part of application underscore start. So what I will do, whenever my application is started, so all the dependencies should be registered here. That's why call register component methods of unit config, which is available under here. So if I call this method, what it will do, it will register the dependencies of IEmplay service and IEmplay repository. Now, whenever I call this controller, what happens? First, the constructor of this controller will be invoked. So here I used IEmplay service. What happens? So your dependency injection, unit config dependency injection will take care of injecting. So wherever you refer this, there it will take care of injecting that corresponding class object. So if I use here IEmplay repository, so what happens? It will take care of injecting employee repository object. So like this, you can install and you can register a number of times. Now my service is started. Now I got employee data. Okay. Keep a breakpoint here. Call your service. See, whenever I call this employee controller, first constructor will be invoked. Here I referred an employee service. So what it will do? So it will go to your unit config. So here we already register. Wherever I refer an employee service, their employee service object has to be injected. So what it will do? It will inject, it will create instance of your employee object, and it will be injected into this variable. And we are storing that into local variable. Now instance of your employee service will be stored into this local variable. And using this, you'll be able to make calls to all properties of this particular service. Now see, now I'm going to call get employees. It got executed, right? And again, if I hit this, so what happens? The instance will be injected, but it will not recreate the instance every time, because here we are using singleton method. If I just use single instance, what happens? Every time it will create a separate object. Okay, here I used singleton, so that's why it will reuse. So whenever the first request from first user comes to the service, it will create instance of employee service, and that will be maintained within your main memory. And that same object will be injected every time towards different sub requests. So that is the beauty of singleton design pattern. So this is something about your dependency injection. Simple. If you want to implement dependency injection explicitly, just right click on references, go to NuGet packages, go to NuGet packages, and get these two installed. What are those? Unity.pb and Unity.container. So once you install these two packages, so it will add one config file under your app.start. That config is going to be unity.config. All you need to do here is just register your types. Okay. So if you want your object has to be injected wherever you refer the corresponding interface. So register those. Okay. What is the interface and what is the object has to be created? So wherever I refer this throughout the application, wherever I refer employee service will be injected. wherever employee repository will be there. So like this, you can register a number of types based on your requirement. So once this registration is done, now what has to be done? Register component has to be called whenever my application is started. This method has to be called to register these types. So from where do I call this method? So whenever your application is started, we have a global configuration file called global.acx. Okay, so whenever the application is started, this method will be invoked automatically. So if you want something has to be registered when my application is started, so that has to be part of this method. So go to this method and call register components of unit config. So unit config.register component, right? Whenever your application is started, this method will be invoked, and whatever is part of this method, those methods will also be invoked. So whenever application is started, it calls register components. What register component will do? It will register the dependencies of all these interfaces.